I'm Sharon Fry from the Santa Rosa Quilt Guild, and today I'm going to give you some ideas on how to make a bullseye quilt. These are circles that are really easy to make. The quilt behind me I made. These are very difficult curves to sew. These need pins. These you have to be very careful with. These you have to press. The ones I'm going to show you don't need any of those things. Pablo Picasso, the master painter, said that first we're supposed to learn the rules and then we can break them. Well, as long as you appreciate that all of these curves were perfectly done, then we can skip that and we'll go to the fun way of making a bullseye quilt. This is the bullseye quilt. This is the block. If you look closely, you will see that the seam allowance has not been turned under. This is the key to the block. The more you wash your project, the more you play with it, the more texture you're going to get. Now, because there are layers of fabric, we need to cut away the extra layers, and if you're careful, you'll have some really great little circles to play with. Then we'll make a second generation of quilts from the leftovers. Here we have leftovers from the first quilt. You'll see that the block is smaller and the curves are smaller. Once again, if you cut away the leftovers underneath, you will come up with a smaller block and a smaller one, until finally the pieces were so small that all I had left were circles. So I made a vest, and then I had more circles, and this maybe is one of my favorite little contemporary quilts. So you started out with a very traditional drunkard's path block, and look at all of the different arrangements that you can make with that one block. I got the idea for the bullseye block from a book called Quilts from Aunt Amy. I just absolutely loved the quilt that was on the cover of the book. I have taken their idea and gone on with some of my own ideas that I'm going to share with you today. In order to make a bullseye block, you're going to start out with 4 pieces of fabric for each of the blocks that you make. For the sake of this demonstration, we're going to cut a 9-inch square block. Then you'll want a contrasting piece of fabric that is 8 inches square. Your next piece will be a contrast from your second piece, and it can be similar to your first piece. This will be a 6-inch square. Then your last piece, the center of the bullseye block, is a 4-inch square. Now, to make your life really easy, take each of those pieces, fold them into quarters, and press them with an iron. That way, you're going to get the centers of each of the 4 sides. Then, you've got your largest piece, your 9-inch piece, which we'll call the base block. Take your second largest piece, which is your 8-inch piece, of the contrasting, which is your red fabric. And with it folded into quarters, you are going to cut it into a circle. Now, you can take your compass and you can make an 8-inch circle, and then you put your template on top of your folded piece of fabric, and make sure that you've got the apex at the corner where all of your folds are. You don't want to cut it incorrectly. Take scissors and do it freehand. It's okay. You really can't mess this up. And cut out the excess. And you can do an Eleanor Burns with the excess and throw it over your shoulder. But I'm going to save this for something. I have no idea what. But someday I'm going to have extras. So now you've got a circle. And you open it up. And you're going to place your red circle on top of your blue base fabric. Here's where those press marks really come in handy. If you line up those press marks from on each of the fabrics, it will be perfectly centered. If you want to use pins, go ahead and put some pins. Once you do a couple of these, you won't have to. Now, take this to your sewing machine. You've got a choice. I used red thread in the top, navy in the bottom, and I didn't change that bobbin throughout the whole project. If you want to use a contrasting thread on top of the red, you may do that. If you want to put in a clear thread, that's okay too. And you're going to stitch approximately 1/4 inch inside of the red circle. So you're stitching the red circle down onto the blue base fabric. If your stitching wobbles a little bit and you're not quite 1/4 inch, plus or minus, don't worry about it. It's okay. Good hint. Start your stitching at one of the fold marks. You're going to be cutting there. That way, any of your starting and stopping will be taken up in the seam allowance. You won't see it. Nope, you don't have to backstitch either. See, I told you it was easy. Okay. Now, this is what it's going to look like when it's stitched down. And see, it's not turned under. Now you've got 2 pieces of fabric here. If you keep layering circles on top of circles, eventually you're going to have 4 pieces of fabric, and that's just going to be too thick. So what you need to do is flip your fabric over to the back. You're going to take your red fabric circle and pull it away from your blue background. And then, craft scissors are nice, but whatever you're comfortable with. I'm going to start cutting at those fold marks. You're going to just take a little snip, make sure that you haven't got your red fabric caught in the scissors, and you're going to continue to cut out the blue background fabric, and that is going to give you a nice circle. You don't have to be too fussy with this. Do the best you can. You're going to cut about 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you cut a larger seam allowance, you're going to have a smaller circle left over. So now you've got the front and the back, and you have a leftover. Now, Eleanor Burns, no, we're not going to throw this over our shoulder. This is going to be a second generation of quilts. We're going to set that aside. Okay, next step, you're going to take your next smallest piece of fabric, which is a blue one. You're going to cut that into a 6-inch circle with your template. You're going to layer that on top of your red fabric, lining up those 4 press marks. You're going to stitch. Now here, it's nice to have a second sewing machine. I had blue threaded in the second machine, and you stitch around it, or you could have stitched it with red in your initial sewing machine or with your clear colored thread. Don't forget to flip it over and cut away that blue. Actually, you're going to be cutting away the red background, and you're going to save that circle. So now you've got an even smaller circle. Then you're going to come down don't forget to cut away, and you're going to put the last circle on, the 4th one. This is the 4-inch square that you're going to make into a 4-inch circle. Cut it with your template, cut away your excess, save it for another day, another project. And then what you're going to end up with is a square. Looks like a bullseye, doesn't it? You're going to take a ruler, and because you start out with a 9-inch square, half of that is 4.5. You're going to cut this into quarters. That makes it 4.5-inch squares. You're going to line up your square at the 4.5-inch mark, and a double check is it's going to be right on that press line. You're going to cut it into 4 equal parts, and here you have your traditional drunkard's path block without having to turn over any seams, not having to pin, and just having fun. Now, after you've made all of your blocks for your quilt, what I like to do is take the 4 identical blocks, and I like to divide those up into 4 piles. Take your next block, divide them up into 4 separate piles. So when you go to your design wall, you can take one pile, and all of the blocks you can start putting up on your design wall, and because they're in different quadrants, you won't have repeats. Now, there's nothing wrong with having 2 of them together, but I think it just makes it a little more interesting. When you go to sew your blocks together, now you're going to do right sides together. Use your 1/4-inch seam, press it open, and you may note that maybe some of the paths do not line up perfectly. That's okay. It just gives it more interest and more texture. The more you wash your piece, the more texture you're going to get. Now, wasn't that easy? And you didn't spend all day and worry about turning those seams underneath to make your drunkard's path block. Okay. I'm going to show you a series of red, white, and blue bullseye quilts that I've made. The first one, the 9-inch block, was put into a king-size quilt and sent off to Sacramento to be raffled for the breast cancer research. This is the 2nd generation. The blocks got smaller because I used all of the small pieces that I had cut away from the original block. Now, I could have taken the 9-inch block and had smaller circles, but instead I decided to use a smaller base block, and because the first fabric I needed to have for the base fabric had to contrast. If I used the blue the first time, I used the red for the second generation for the base. Now remember, there's all sorts of ways to put a drunkard's path block together, and you'll have a lot of fun experimenting with it. This shows that the blocks are getting smaller and a different way to put them together. Smaller still. Now the center is made of one size block, and then I have put in a border using even smaller blocks. This is one of my very favorite ways of putting the drunkard's path together. I did it once. I will never do it again. I will never teach it in a class. It was too difficult. It was a puzzle, but I sure had fun doing it. The way that I've put the drunkard's path blocks together on this vest is called a dove in flight. Now on the back, I decided to do the traditional bullseye in the center, and then I got kind of wacky and slashed it, cut them up, and just had fun with it. There are no rules. One day I experimented with the red, black, and white, and instead of leaving the seam allowances exposed, I decided to try out all of the different stitches on my sewing machine and stitch them down kind of like a Victorian crazy quilt. And if you don't like the color combinations I've shown you so far, try this one. This is kind of bright and wacky. And in this quilt, I decided I wanted to see how many different drunkard's path patterns I could put into one quilt. And as you see, I have at least 2 different size circles. So, use a few of my tips. Remember that you can hardly do anything wrong with this, and have fun. And I hope to see some of your bullseye quilts someday. Thank you.